out-Yorked the British at the Battle of Long Island in the summer, the Americans were forced to retreat to Delaware during the late summer of 1776. George Washington was desperate to turn things around.
The only way to get to Trenton without being detected by the British was to boat down the Delaware River. It was a harsh winter and crossing the river was risky. The river itself had ice forming on the surface.
The plan was to cross the Delaware River at 3 points, one accompanied by Delaware and Pennsylvania troops. The second was led by General Ewing, and the third led by George Washington and Nathaniel Greene with John Sullivan.
Nature wasn't on the American side. The snow and cold weather reduced the chance of being able to take Trenton. Halfway in their march to battle, they met another American force led by Adams Stephen. Washington soon became more confident.
When they first came upon the other force, they were frightened that it was not an American force. But when they discovered that they were Americans, Washington became less nervous about the march in.
When a German lieutenant came out of the copper shop and was shot at by an American, the battle began. The lieutenant started yelling, "Der Feind," which means the enemy. Some of his men started to run away from the shop and surrounded the lieutenant.
The small force was no match for the American troops, and they fastly organized a retreat. Washington knew he needed to prevent the retreat for the Hessians, so he ordered some of his men to assemble near Princeton and near a Sun Peak Creek. Prussians started to shoot at the Americans near the creek. Prussians retreated after seeing all of the troops that were advancing. Other Hessian forces heard the shots fired and grouped along Trenton to overpower them. The Hessians soon retreated when they realized they miscalculated. The Hessians were no match for the Americans. When the Hessians' colonel was shot, they began to scatter. The Hessians surrendered. The victory of the Battle of Trenton encouraged the Americans to push ahead in the fight for independence.
Washington and his troops retreated after being overtaken at Trenton. They were forced across the Delaware River, crossing back over into Trenton. Washington was alerted nearly 24 hours later that 8,000 British troops were on their way to attack. Cornwallis split his troops into two sections, one in the north and one at the south.
On January 2nd, 1777, Cornwallis's armies arrived. It was pounding rain by the time the battle engaged. Eventually, the rain got too heavy, and both sides broke off and would resume fighting in the morning.
During the night, the Americans left fire at their campsite and headed around the British Army to Princeton.
The British thought they were Hessians that had turned on them, so the British left the city. The British realized their mistake and tried to rearrange themselves. The Continental Army had almost won. After a horrific fight, the Americans took Princeton. Then, a British force arrived. The Americans were now discouraged.
After the war, which the Americans won, Washington's troops were weak. Just in time, Sullivan, an American general, brought reinforcements that rejuvenated the soldiers. When Cornwallis returned to find that Princeton had been taken by the Americans, he and his troops retreated to New Brunswick, New Jersey, to end the war.